Good evening, all, and welcome back to Dark Fears. Tonight, we venture into the forgotten corners of the American countryside, where isolated small towns hide dark secrets, and the endless wilderness swallows those who wander too far. Across 10 horrifying encounters, ordinary people have faced events so disturbing, so real, that the echoes of their experiences continue to haunt them. These are not legends or campfire tales. From abandoned farmhouses to basements hiding unspeakable secrets, from creatures that should not exist to disappearances that defy explanation. Tonight, you will hear horrors that linger long after the lights go out. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Dark Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the American countryside, where civilization ends and terror begins. My name is Daniel Carter, and this happened when I moved to a small, forgotten town in the American countryside called Hollow Creek. I had just inherited my grandfather's old farmhouse, a crumbling relic surrounded by endless fields and dense woods that no one seemed to enter. The locals were polite but distant, and there was a tension in the air that I couldn't explain. I thought it was just the isolation getting to me, but that assumption would soon prove fatal. The first night, I wandered through the overgrown yard, flashlight in hand, trying to familiarize myself with the land. The wind whispered through the skeletal trees, carrying a faint, almost human sigh. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was nothing more than the house settling or the wind playing tricks. Yet, when I reached the old barn, I heard it again. A low, deliberate whisper. "Daniel." Frozen, I scanned the darkness, but there was nothing. My rational mind screamed that I was alone, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Every instinct told me to run, but I was paralyzed by curiosity, drawn to the shadows that seemed to move just beyond the edge of my light. That night, I would hear the first of many whispers, the beginning of a horror that would not let me leave Hollow Creek alive or sane. The next morning, sunlight did little to calm the unease that had settled over me. Hollow Creek was quiet, too quiet. Birds didn't sing, and even the wind seemed hesitant to stir. I tried to rationalize the previous night's whispers, blaming exhaustion or imagination. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Exploring the farmhouse, I discovered my grandfather's journal tucked behind a loose brick in the fireplace. The pages were yellowed, and the ink had bled in places, but I could still make out his scrawled handwriting. He wrote about strange occurrences, people disappearing, and voices that called from the woods. I dismissed it at first, telling myself old men write nonsense when they are lonely. But then I read a line that chilled me to the bone. They watch, and they never forget. That evening, I decided to walk down the overgrown path toward the creek behind the house, hoping fresh air would clear my mind. The tall grass whispered as I moved through it, brushing against my legs like unseen fingers. I paused when I saw footprints, barefoot, too small to be mine, leading into the woods and then abruptly stopping. The silence pressed in on me, heavier than the darkness the night before, and I felt eyes watching from the trees. I realized then that the whispers were only the beginning. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing through the empty halls of the farmhouse. I lay in bed, straining my ears, heart pounding as the shadows seemed to stretch along the walls. Each whisper sounded different, sometimes my name, sometimes incoherent murmurs that sent chills down my spine. I grabbed the flashlight and crept into the hallway, trying to locate the source. When I reached the barn, I saw movement in the corner of my eye. A figure crouched just beyond the reach of the light. I called out, but there was no response, only the whispering that now seemed to circle me, taunting. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished, leaving behind a cold, almost tangible silence. I felt my chest tighten and realized that this was no ordinary haunting. Something was in the house, something that had been waiting for me. The next day, I confronted the locals, hoping for guidance, but their reactions were strange, avoidant, almost fearful. They spoke in hushed tones about Hollow Creek's past, of families who vanished, and of things in the woods that should not exist. The unease I felt wasn't mine alone. It was shared by generations, passed down like a curse that clung to the land itself. Determined to uncover the truth, I began investigating the forest surrounding the property during the day, thinking daylight would make it safer. But the woods seemed alive, whispering my name as though mocking my courage. Strange markings appeared on trees, deep scratches that formed patterns I couldn't comprehend. Some were human-like, some impossibly elongated, as if made by creatures not of this world. One afternoon, I found an old, hidden well near the edge of the property. Its stones were slick with moss, and the air around it was unnaturally cold. Peering down, I could see nothing but blackness, yet I felt an intense pressure to look deeper, as if the well itself were calling me. I resisted backing away, but that night the whispers led me to the very same well from inside the farmhouse. The voices were louder now, pleading, angry, insistent. I began recording the sounds on my phone, hoping to prove I wasn't imagining things. Listening later, I could hear words I didn't recognize, chanting in unison with my own name threaded through them. My fear was growing faster than I could manage. Something in Hollow Creek had noticed me, and the warning signs were clear. It did not want me here. By the fifth night, the farmhouse had become a place I no longer recognized. Shadows moved with their own intent, whispering and circling, slipping between walls where no door existed. Sleep was impossible. I barricaded my bedroom door, yet the whispers found me there, clawing at my mind with urgent insistence. I could feel eyes on my every movement. I realized too late that running from the darkness only made it stronger. I ventured outside that night, drawn inexplicably to the fields. The moonlight revealed shapes shifting between the tall grass. I caught glimpses of figures, hulking silhouettes that hunched and skittered, moving unnaturally fast. When I called out, they froze, then disappeared into the shadows. Panic set in, but curiosity, a foolish sense of bravery, kept me moving closer to the source. That's when I saw it. A shadowy figure emerging from the tree line, faceless, yet emanating an aura of intent and hunger. I stumbled backward, screaming, but my voice seemed to vanish into the night. The figure paused, watching, and then melted into the darkness, leaving a silence so thick it pressed against my chest. I knew then that Hollow Creek was alive, and I was no longer a visitor. I was prey. The following morning, I discovered deep gouges along the farmhouse walls, scratches that had not been there before. They were jagged, frenzied, and unnervingly fresh. I realized that whatever had been watching me the night before had entered the house, unseen but very real. My grandfather's warnings in his journal echoed in my mind. They watch, and they never forget. Desperate, I tried to communicate with the locals again, but they avoided me entirely. One elderly man muttered something about the Hollow Creek curse before hurrying away, leaving me with more questions than answers. I began obsessively marking every sound, every movement, every whisper, trying to detect a pattern. Each recording I played back revealed new voices, always calling my name, overlapping with unintelligible chants. That night, the whispers grew frantic. I could hear them moving from room to room, the sound of footsteps pacing along the creaking floors. I knew it wasn't just one entity. It was many, an unseen multitude waiting, plotting. Fear consumed me, yet I could not leave. Something about this land, this house, held me captive. And in the deepest shadows of the barn, I glimpsed eyes reflecting a cold, inhuman intelligence, and understood for the first time Hollow Creek had chosen me. By the seventh night, I had stopped pretending I was safe. Every creak, every whisper, every flicker of shadow confirmed that I was being hunted. I could no longer sleep, no longer trust my own senses. The farmhouse seemed alive, groaning and shifting as if it breathed with the darkness itself. I tried to leave, but the roads twisted strangely in the fog, leading me back to the same cursed land. That night, the whispers turned into guttural murmurs, echoing from the forest beyond the fields. I grabbed my grandfather's journal for guidance, flipping to a passage I had overlooked. When the eyes appear, do not run, or you shall vanish. Terrified, yet compelled, I went to the barn, where I had first glimpsed the shadowy figure. There I saw dozens of glowing eyes staring from the darkness, moving with an unnatural intelligence. They circled me silently, a cold, malevolent presence that chilled my very soul. The whispers intensified, each voice layered over another, chanting in unison. I could feel their attention, their hunger, pressing down, trying to pull me toward the woods. The air itself seemed to thicken, suffocating me. I realized then that the stories of Hollow Creek were not exaggerated. I had become part of them, trapped in a nightmare older than the town itself. As I backed away from the barn, I stumbled into the tall grass and fell hard. When I looked up, the eyes were closer. Dozens of figures moving with eerie precision, their forms partially hidden in shadow. My flashlight flickered, then died, leaving only the moonlight to illuminate the nightmare. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed instantly by the oppressive silence. Suddenly, one of the figures stepped forward. Unlike the others, it seemed humanoid, yet its face was featureless, smooth, like a mask of darkness. Its presence radiated malice, and I felt my will faltering under its gaze. I tried to retreat, but my legs refused to obey. The others circled closer, whispering in voices that chilled me to the bone. Panic gave way to a cold clarity. These were not spirits, not ghosts. They were something else entirely, guardians of Hollow Creek, and I was trespassing where no one survived. In a desperate bid, I threw myself toward the creek, hoping to reach the water and break whatever grip the land had on me. The figures paused at the bank, whispering in unison one last warning, a sound that penetrated my mind and left me trembling. Never leave, never return. The moon reflected off the water, but in the darkness beyond, I could see them waiting, patient, eternal, and unyielding. I reached the edge of the creek, my body trembling, lungs burning from the cold night air. The figures halted at the water's edge, but the whispers didn't stop. They swirled in my mind like a storm. A chorus of voices repeating my name, recounting my every thought and fear. I realized then that escaping Hollow Creek wasn't about running. It was about surviving the relentless gaze of its unseen guardians. Summoning every ounce of courage, I plunged into the icy water, letting the current carry me downstream. My heart hammered as the whispers followed, echoing from the banks and the trees, never letting me feel safe. Moments felt like hours. The cold gnawed at me, and shadows danced across the water, forming shapes too twisted to comprehend. I saw glimpses of the farmhouse, the barn, and the forest. Places I had once called home, now transformed into a labyrinth of horror. By the time I crawled to the opposite bank, soaked and shivering, I thought I had escaped. But a low, guttural sigh followed me, a sound that would haunt every memory of Hollow Creek. I knew the eyes were still there, watching, waiting for the moment I would falter. The land had marked me, and nothing could change that. Weeks later, I returned to the farmhouse, driven by a compulsion I could not explain. Everything seemed normal by day, but the shadows stretched unnaturally at dusk, and the wind carried soft, malevolent whispers. I realized I had not left Hollow Creek behind. The land had left a part of itself inside me. I began recording again, hoping to capture proof of the horror. The whispers returned on tape, but now they were different. Clearer, more deliberate. "You belong here," they said, repeating over and over. I fled into the woods, knowing the eyes were always following. Hollow Creek had no intention of letting me go, and I understood that survival here was temporary at best. I left the property for good, but every night I hear the whispers again in my dreams. Faces appear in shadows, and I wake shaking, feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon me. Hollow Creek isn't just a place, it's a predator, patient and eternal. I escaped physically, but my mind is trapped forever in its frozen, whispering darkness. And sometimes, I wonder how many others the town has claimed before me, and how long it will be before it comes for me again. My name is Emily Lawson, and this nightmare began when my family moved to Black Hollow, a remote stretch of farmland in the American countryside. The house we rented was old, creaking with every gust of wind, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to swallow light and sound. Locals warned us not to wander at night, but as a curious teenager, I ignored their advice. I thought it was just small-town superstition, until the first night revealed the truth. I woke around midnight to the sound of faint scratching on my bedroom window. At first, I assumed it was a branch, but the sound was deliberate, rhythmic, almost like claws tracing the glass. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself I was imagining things. Yet a cold draft whispered through the room, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. Heart pounding, I turned on my flashlight, revealing nothing but shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls. As I lay back down, I noticed something strange. Faint footprints on the wooden floor, too small to be human, leading toward the door. The whispering began soon after, soft at first, unintelligible but growing louder and clearer with every passing second. My name was being called, elongated and twisted, echoing from the darkness beyond the walls. I realized then that something in Black Hollow had noticed me, and it was patient, waiting for the perfect moment to make itself known. The next morning, I tried to tell my parents about the noises and the footprints, but they dismissed me, attributing it to my imagination or fatigue from the move. I wanted to believe them, but deep down, I knew something was very wrong. Black Hollow didn't feel like any ordinary countryside. It felt alive, watching, waiting. That afternoon, I explored the edge of the woods behind the house, hoping daylight would reveal the source of the whispers. The trees were dense, twisted, and far older than the house itself. As I ventured deeper, I found symbols carved into the bark, strange, jagged markings resembling distorted human figures intertwined with impossible angles. My stomach churned as I realized the carvings were fresh, the cuts glistening slightly in the sunlight. I stepped back instinctively, and a faint rustling followed me, as if something unseen had been following all along. Later that night, the whispers returned, louder and clearer. They were not just calling my name. They were telling me things I had never told anyone, secrets only I could know. My bedroom seemed smaller, the walls pressing in, and I could see shadows slithering across the ceiling, distorting as if alive. Fear gripped me, but curiosity kept me from fleeing. I knew the entities in Black Hollow were intelligent, patient, and malevolent, and I sensed that the longer I stayed, the more they would reveal, and the harder it would be to leave unscathed. By the third night, the whispers had grown aggressive. They were no longer just voices. They were commands, urging me to follow them into the woods. I tried to resist, but the pull was irresistible, a mixture of fear and something deeper, primal. I could feel the presence moving through the house, brushing past walls and slipping through cracks that shouldn't exist. Determined to confront whatever haunted Black Hollow, I grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the yard. The moonlight illuminated the trees, casting shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally, almost alive. I saw something move, a dark, humanoid figure, slender and unnervingly tall, watching me from the edge of the forest, its head tilted unnaturally, as if studying me, learning me. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, but my legs froze in place, and the whispers grew louder, layering over themselves in a chorus that pierced my mind. The figure stepped forward into the moonlight, revealing elongated limbs that bent at impossible angles. Its face was obscured, featureless, yet somehow expressive in its malice. For the first time, I realized this was not a ghost or human. It was something entirely different, something that had been waiting in Black Hollow for decades, maybe centuries. The fourth night was worse. Sleep offered no respite, only visions of shadowy figures moving through the house. I began to hear scratching beneath the floorboards and soft thumps coming from the walls. I could feel eyes following me wherever I went, and even when I tried to leave. The whispers guided me back, as if the land itself had a hold on me. I decided to investigate the attic, a space I had avoided until now. The narrow stairs creaked under my weight, and the smell of damp wood and decay filled my nose. Halfway up, I felt a cold hand brush my shoulder. I spun around, nothing. Only darkness stared back at me. Reaching the attic, I found old belongings left by previous tenants. Diaries, torn photographs, and strange dried symbols drawn on the walls. One diary entry read, "They move in the shadows. They wait for the lost. Never answer the call." The whispers intensified as I read, now sounding almost like laughter. I could hear them circling, moving through the walls, filling the attic with a pressure that made it hard to breathe. I realized then that I was not alone, and that Black Hollow had been waiting for me long before I ever arrived. The horror was patient, intelligent, and hungry. By the fifth night, I had begun to understand that Black Hollow was not just a location. It was alive, aware of me, and intent on claiming me. The whispers had grown insistent, layering over each other, repeating my name, mocking my fear. I could feel their presence crawling under the floorboards, pressing against the walls, wrapping the house in a cold, suffocating embrace. Determined to face whatever haunted the property, I ventured into the woods with a flashlight. The dense forest swallowed the light, and shadows moved independently of the trees. The air was heavy, almost viscous, carrying faint murmurs and a metallic scent. That's when I saw them. Dozens of figures, slender and faceless, partially hidden behind trees. They didn't move like humans, but glided, their motions smooth, deliberate, and impossible. Panic rose in my chest, but I couldn't look away. One figure stepped forward, and for the first time, I noticed its twisted arms, bending in impossible angles. It raised a hand, pointing toward the house, as if instructing the others. The whispers escalated, overlapping, now urgent and demanding. I realized I was being lured, trapped in a psychological web that preyed on curiosity and fear. Black Hollow wasn't just haunted. It was predatory, patient, and aware of every step I took. I had no choice but to continue, driven by both terror and a morbid fascination with the darkness surrounding me. That night, the figures drew closer to the farmhouse, their presence palpable even from inside. I could hear the soft thuds of their movement on the roof, the floorboards, the walls. The whispers had become intelligible, a chorus of sinister guidance. Join us. Follow. Surrender. The very air felt thick with intent, and I realized there was nowhere to hide. I barricaded doors and windows, but the shadows slipped through cracks, bending and twisting unnaturally. I clutched my grandfather's old journal for reassurance, hoping it contained clues. There were hints, passages warning of entities that lived in the forest, feeding on fear, guiding the curious to their doom. I began to understand why the locals had been so evasive, so fearful. Black Hollow was a predator with patience older than anyone could comprehend, and it was testing me, seeing how far it could push my mind before claiming me entirely. Then I heard it, a whisper at my ear, not coming from the walls, not from the floor, but directly from the air around me. It said my name in a voice I had never heard before, intimate and terrifying, like it knew my deepest fears. I froze, heart hammering, knowing that the next step would determine whether I survived the night or became part of the shadows themselves. By the seventh night, I was no longer certain where the house ended and the forest began. The shadows moved seamlessly through walls, floors, and ceilings, their presence pressing against my sanity. I could hear multiple whispers layering over one another, chanting my name, recounting thoughts I had never spoken aloud. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but the forest and the house had become one entity, and it seemed determined to trap me inside. I decided to confront the darkness directly, venturing outside despite the cold dread clutching at my chest. The yard was alive with movement, faceless, elongated figures emerging from the trees, circling silently. One figure stepped forward, more defined than the others, its head tilted unnaturally, studying me. The whispers converged into a single, commanding voice. "You cannot leave." Panic surged, but I forced myself to keep moving, realizing that showing fear only strengthened them. As I approached the edge of the forest, the figures parted slightly, revealing the woods beyond. I glimpsed twisted shapes moving in unnatural coordination, all focused on me. I understood, with a sinking certainty, that Black Hollow did not merely harbor horrors, it was the horrors. The land itself had eyes, patience, and intent, and I was the intruder who had awoken its attention. The eighth night, I realized there was no escape without confrontation. The shadows had followed me inside, creeping along walls, floors, and ceilings. Their whispers filled the house entirely, relentless and insidious, each one pulling at my mind. I could no longer differentiate between reality and hallucination. I took a flashlight and ventured into the forest one final time, determined to face whatever haunted Black Hollow. The air was thick with fog, and the forest seemed to breathe around me. Figures emerged, gliding silently between the trees, glowing eyes fixed on me. One advanced, more defined than the others, its limbs bending at impossible angles, and I could feel its intent pressing directly into my mind. My flashlight flickered, illuminating symbols carved into trees and the ground. Ritualistic, old, warning me of the forest's ownership over all who entered. As I stepped back, I tripped and fell into a shallow pit covered with twigs. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening chorus, layered with distorted laughter. I realized then that the entities were testing me, measuring my fear, drawing me into a web I could not escape. Every instinct screamed to run, but I understood that running alone would not save me. Survival depended on navigating the darkness, outsmarting an intelligence far older and more patient than any human mind could comprehend. By the 9th night, exhaustion had taken over. My mind was frayed, every sound amplified, every shadow a potential threat. I realized the forest and the house were not separate. They were one living, breathing entity, feeding on my fear and curiosity. The whispers had become intelligent, almost conversational, pressing against my thoughts with unrelenting force. Determined to survive, I navigated through the fog and toward an old clearing I had glimpsed earlier. The figures followed silently, circling me, their faceless forms reflecting moonlight in unsettling ways. I noticed strange, ritualistic objects scattered in the clearing: bones, tattered cloth, and symbols etched into the dirt. The whispers intensified, chanting words I could barely understand, urging me to join them, to surrender. As I stood frozen, one figure emerged from the shadows, taller and more imposing than the rest. Its featureless face seemed to study me, radiating a sense of ancient patience and malevolent intelligence. I realized then that the forest didn't just haunt, it trapped, tested, and chose its victims. The entities wanted more than fear. They wanted control. Panic surged, but I forced myself to focus, knowing that losing my mind would make me theirs. I had to find a way out, or I would vanish into Black Hollow like so many before me. The 10th night brought the climax. I realized that running would accomplish nothing. Black Hollow had me, and it intended to claim me fully. The whispers were deafening, echoing from every direction, pressing against my mind, making it impossible to think clearly. I stood in the clearing, heart pounding, and watched as the figures approached in a slow, deliberate march. In a desperate act, I grabbed a fallen branch and swung it at the nearest figure. It passed through, hitting nothing, yet the entity recoiled as if amused. That's when I understood. The forest, the house, the shadows, they were testing me, observing my reactions, measuring my fear. I had no physical enemy, only a living nightmare that existed to manipulate and torment. I stumbled backward, finally breaking through the edge of the forest and running into the moonlit fields. Behind me, the figures halted, watching silently, their whispers fading but never disappearing entirely. I escaped physically, but the psychological weight followed me, lingering in dreams and the periphery of my vision. Black Hollow had claimed a piece of me, a mark that would never fade. I understood now that some places are not haunted. They are predators, patient and eternal, and those who enter may never leave whole. My name is Thomas Reynolds, and the nightmare began the day I accepted work at a secluded farm in the American countryside. The land was vast, stretching into rolling hills and dense forests that swallowed the horizon. The locals were polite but reserved, their eyes darting nervously whenever I mentioned staying overnight. They spoke in vague warnings about the old ways and things that linger in the fields. But I dismissed them as superstition until my first night on the property proved otherwise. The farmhouse was older than I expected, its walls groaning with the wind and creaking with every subtle movement. As darkness fell, I wandered into the barn to check on the livestock. That's when I first heard it, a low guttural hum emanating from the farthest corner. It wasn't the animals, nor any machine. The sound was deliberate, almost rhythmic, pulsing like a heartbeat in the shadows. As I shined my flashlight toward the corner, I saw movement, fleeting but unmistakable. Something crouched low, elongated and unnervingly still. The hum intensified, vibrating through the floorboards and into my chest. I felt my hair stand on end and a cold dread seep into my bones. That's when I realized the farm was alive with something hidden, patient, and malevolent. Something that had been waiting for me. The next day, I tried to shake off the fear that had gripped me the night before. The farm seemed peaceful in daylight, with golden fields swaying in the wind and livestock moving lazily in the barn. But the memory of that low, vibrating hum lingered in my mind, and the shadow in the corner refused to leave my thoughts. Determined to understand, I explored the property further. Near the back fields, I discovered odd markings etched into the soil, lines forming geometric patterns I didn't recognize. Some were fresh, others seemed older, overgrown with weeds. A chill ran down my spine as I realized these marks weren't natural. They were deliberately placed, like someone, or something, had been preparing the land for a ritual. By nightfall, the farmhouse became oppressive. Every floorboard creak, every rustle of leaves outside felt intentional, as if the land itself were alive, observing my every move. The hum returned, this time louder, vibrating through the walls. Shadows twisted and shifted independently, stretching across the floors and walls in unnatural ways. I could sense presence after presence, surrounding me, patient and deliberate. Something in the fields, something unseen, was watching. And I realized with growing horror that this farm was not merely a workplace, it was a trap. And I was now caught in it, alone, with forces that had been lying in wait for anyone foolish enough to trespass. By the third night, fear had taken root in every corner of the farmhouse. The hum that had started in the barn was now everywhere. Low, constant, vibrating through the walls, floorboards, and ceilings. It wasn't just sound. It was a presence, as if the building itself was breathing with intent. Every shadow stretched too long, every corner warped unnaturally, and the air grew heavier with each passing hour. I tried to ignore it, to sleep, but something compelled me to return to the barn. The door creaked as I entered, and the hum intensified. Shadows moved with purpose, circling the hay bales, converging in the darkest corners. Then I saw it. A figure, impossibly tall and slender, crouched low, its limbs bending unnaturally. Its face was featureless, yet I felt its eyes piercing into my very thoughts. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, but the figure moved silently, gliding toward me without a sound. Panic gave way to frozen fascination. I realized this wasn't a mere animal or human intruder. It was something far older, something that had been living in the fields for decades, waiting for an unsuspecting trespasser to stumble into its domain. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet my curiosity, foolish and fatal, kept me rooted. The fourth night, the horror escalated. The hum had transformed into a low chant, rhythmic and deliberate, echoing from the barn and into the farmhouse. I could feel vibrations in my chest, a resonance that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. Sleep was impossible. Even my waking hours were plagued by shadows that stretched unnaturally across walls and floors. I decided to explore the surrounding fields under the moonlight. The crops swayed as if pushed by an invisible force, forming corridors that led to the center of the land. There, I found remnants of old rituals, broken stakes, dried herbs, and animal bones arranged in patterns that chilled me to the bone. It was clear that whoever, or whatever, had occupied this farm had been performing ceremonies for generations, harnessing something dark and malignant that lingered in the soil itself. As I walked back toward the farmhouse, I felt the air thicken. Shapes moved in the corners of my vision, vanishing whenever I turned to face them. A cold whisper grazed my ear. "You belong here." I froze, realizing that Black Hollow was not the only cursed land in America. This farm had its own consciousness, a predator hiding in plain sight, patient, intelligent, and terrifyingly alive. By the fifth night, I knew that hiding was futile. The farmhouse had become a vessel for the darkness in the fields, alive with whispers, hums, and shifting shadows. Every step I took felt watched, measured, as if the land itself were calculating my fear and patience. Sleep was impossible. The air pressed against me with cold, insidious intent. I ventured into the barn again, determined to confront the entity that haunted the property. Shadows writhed along the walls, forming shapes that defied logic. The figure from before crouched in the farthest corner, taller than any human, limbs bending unnaturally, its featureless face turned toward me. I raised my flashlight, and the beam trembled in my hands. The figure moved closer, but not with haste. Every step deliberate, methodical, almost ceremonial. The hum transformed into a chant that resonated through the floorboards, a vibration that clawed at my chest. I realized that this wasn't just a spirit or ghost. It was something older, intelligent, and patient, feeding on fear, curiosity, and trespass. It wanted to draw me into its domain, to make me part of the land itself. Every instinct screamed to flee, but I was trapped in the web of this living nightmare, a pawn in a game older than the farm itself. The sixth night brought the first direct confrontation. The figure stepped closer, and I could feel the weight of its intent pressing against my mind. The whispers were no longer external. They were inside my head, layered and insistent, repeating my name and my fears in ways I could not escape. My heart pounded, every instinct screaming that the entity was more than physical. It was mental, emotional, and predatory. I backed toward the barn door, but the shadows had grown, stretching to block my exit. The ground beneath me seemed to pulse in rhythm with the hum, and the air itself carried a pressure that made each breath a struggle. I realized the farm itself was alive, an extension of the entity, feeding on my terror. Then, unexpectedly, a gust of wind swept through the barn, scattering hay and dust, giving me a momentary distraction. I sprinted past the figure, barely keeping ahead of the shadows that lunged at me from all directions. The hum remained, but the rhythm had shifted, almost as if the entity were laughing, observing, measuring my resilience. I understood then that escape was not merely about fleeing. It was about surviving the intelligence behind the darkness, something patient, eternal, and malevolent beyond human comprehension. By the seventh night, the farmhouse and the fields had merged into a single, suffocating entity. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, crawling like living things, and the hum had evolved into a chorus of whispers, pressing on my mind with relentless force. Every step I took was mirrored by unseen movements, every breath accompanied by the sensation of eyes tracking me from all directions. Compelled by a mixture of terror and morbid curiosity, I ventured into the field under the pale moonlight. The crops formed unnatural corridors, guiding me toward the center where the rituals had taken place. The earth was disturbed, littered with broken stakes, bones, and remnants of symbols etched into the soil. As I stepped closer, the tall, faceless figure emerged again, this time flanked by smaller, shadowy forms, gliding silently between the stalks. The whispers merged into a single, commanding voice. "You were meant to find us." Panic surged, but I forced myself to focus. I realized that fleeing might be futile. The entity had studied me, understood my fears, and was testing me, drawing me into a trap that existed beyond physical limitations. Black Hollow was not alone in America. This farm, too, had a consciousness, patient, ancient, and malevolent, intent on claiming anyone foolish enough to trespass. The eighth night, I realized that confrontation was inevitable. The whispers followed me into the barn, through the farmhouse, and into the fields themselves. Every sound was magnified. Every shadow seemed to move independently. I could no longer discern reality from hallucination. The entity's presence had invaded my senses entirely. I stepped into the center of the field, flashlight trembling in my hands. The tall figure moved closer, limbs bending at impossible angles, its featureless face tilting as if studying my every reaction. Smaller figures emerged from the shadows, encircling me. The earth beneath my feet pulsed with a hum, vibrating through my body in a rhythm that synchronized with the pounding of my heart. I knew then that this was not a physical threat alone. It was mental, emotional, and spiritual. The farm itself was alive, an extension of the entity, a predator testing me for weaknesses. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening chorus. "Surrender, belong, join us." I backed away slowly, calculating my escape, understanding that survival depended not just on speed, but on outwitting an intelligence older than the land itself. Every instinct screamed to flee, but the forest and the fields seemed to conspire, making every step towards safety a perilous gamble. By the ninth night, exhaustion and terror had merged into a single, oppressive weight. Every creak of the farmhouse, every rustle in the fields, felt deliberate, as if the entity was orchestrating my fear. The whispers had evolved into intelligible commands, taunting me, recounting my deepest secrets, and forcing me to relive my worst memories. Sleep had become impossible. Reality itself seemed to warp under the entity's presence. Determined to survive, I ventured once more into the center of the fields, flashlight trembling in my hands. The tall, featureless figure waited, flanked by smaller, shadowy forms that glided silently among the stalks. The earth pulsed beneath my feet, vibrating in rhythm with the hum that had followed me since my arrival. Symbols etched into the soil glowed faintly, and I realized these weren't mere markings. They were part of the entity's consciousness, extensions of its will. As I froze, the largest figure advanced, its face tilting unnaturally, limbs bending in impossible angles. The smaller figures mirrored its movements, surrounding me in a silent, predatory circle. Panic surged, yet I forced myself to think, understanding that survival required outwitting a being that existed beyond physical reality. The farm had claimed many before me, patient and methodical, and I knew that tonight would determine whether I became another victim or escaped with my mind intact. The 10th night brought the story to its terrifying climax. I understood that fleeing blindly would accomplish nothing. The farm and the shadows had merged into a single consciousness, testing, observing, manipulating every step I took. The whispers were deafening, layered inside my mind, echoing my fears and desires back at me in distorted clarity. I stood in the center of the field, flashlight flickering, as the tall figure and its minions closed in. The earth beneath me pulsed with life, the symbols glowing brighter with every heartbeat. I realized that the entity didn't need to touch me to exert power. Its intelligence was entwined with the very land, pressing against my thoughts, my sanity, and my soul. In a desperate act, I sprinted toward the farmhouse, zigzagging through the crop corridors to avoid the figure's line of sight. Shadows lunged at me, but always missed, as if toying with me. I barely made it inside, slamming the door behind me. The hum and whispers persisted, but at least for a moment, the figures did not follow. I understood then that survival wasn't victory. It was temporary, a fleeting reprieve from an intelligence older and darker than I could comprehend. The farm had marked me, and I would carry the terror of the harvest of dread for the rest of my life. My name is Emily Carter, and this nightmare began the summer I moved to a remote orchard in the American countryside to help my uncle with the harvest. The land was expansive, with rolling hills covered in apple trees, whose branches twisted unnaturally in the wind. The locals were wary, their voices hushed whenever they mentioned the orchard's history. They spoke of disappearances, strange sounds, and shadows that moved when no one was looking. But I dismissed it as rural superstition. The first night, I stayed in the small guest house near the orchard's edge. As I lay in bed, I heard faint whispering carried by the wind. At first, I thought it was the trees rustling, but the voices were deliberate, forming words I couldn't understand. Curiosity tugged at me, and I stepped outside. The moonlight cast long shadows across the orchard, and I glimpsed movement. Figures crouched among the trees, too slender and still to be human. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the whispers were calling my name. Each syllable sent shivers through my body, vibrating in my chest like a low hum. The orchard seemed alive, each tree leaning subtly as if observing me. My instincts screamed to retreat, but fascination rooted me in place. Something in the orchard was waiting, patient, intelligent, and ancient. Something that had been lying in wait for a newcomer. And now, it had found me. The next day, I tried to convince myself that the whispers were just my imagination. The orchard looked serene in daylight, sunlight filtering through the branches, making the leaves shimmer. But an uneasy feeling lingered in the pit of my stomach, and I couldn't shake the memory of the figures I had glimpsed moving silently among the trees. Determined to understand, I explored deeper into the orchard, following faint trails between the gnarled trees. That's when I noticed the ground was marked with strange symbols etched into the soil. Circles, spirals, and line-forming patterns that made no sense to me. Some were fresh, others partially faded, as if left behind by generations long gone. The air felt heavier here, charged with a presence I could almost touch. As dusk fell, the whispers returned, louder, more deliberate, echoing in my mind. I froze, hearing my name repeated in tones both distant and intimate. Shadows twisted unnaturally across the tree trunks, moving independently of the moonlight. Something was observing me, shaping the orchard itself to manipulate my fear. By nightfall, I realized this was no ordinary place. The orchard was alive, sentient, and aware of me. Every tree seemed to lean in, every shadow to watch. I had stepped into a living nightmare, and the whispers were the first sign that the orchard had claimed my attention and was not planning to let it go. By the third night, I could no longer ignore the sense of being hunted. The whispers grew louder, almost intelligible, twisting my thoughts and echoing my fears back at me. Every tree seemed to lean closer, the branches forming grotesque, claw-like shapes in the moonlight. Shadows darted between the trunks, vanishing when I turned to face them. Yet I could sense their presence, patient and calculating. Compelled by both terror and curiosity, I ventured further into the orchard. The symbols etched into the soil glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the whispers. That's when I first saw them clearly. Slender, humanoid figures crouched low among the trees, limbs elongated and bending unnaturally. They moved silently, watching my every step, their featureless faces tilted toward me. Panic surged, but a morbid fascination rooted me in place. I realized this was no ordinary haunting. The orchard was alive, feeding on fear and attention. It had been waiting for me, studying my reactions, and now it was testing me. Each whispered syllable, each shifting shadow seemed to pull me deeper into a trap I didn't yet understand. The fourth night, the orchard's malevolence escalated. The whispers were no longer distant. They were inside my head, layered and insistent, repeating my name and my thoughts in ways that made me question my own sanity. Every sound of rustling leaves or snapping twigs felt orchestrated, a signal from the entities surrounding me. I stepped deeper into the orchard, flashlight trembling, and discovered a clearing in the center where the oldest trees grew. The earth was disturbed, littered with animal bones, broken branches, and ritualistic symbols that seemed to pulse faintly with an inner light. The whispers converged here, commanding, almost hypnotic, urging me to stay, to kneel, to join whatever force had claimed this land. From the shadows, one of the faceless figures emerged, taller than the rest, its limbs bending at impossible angles. Its presence radiated intelligence and malice, and I realized that the orchard was not just haunted. It was sentient. It observed, manipulated, and tested. Fear alone gave it strength, and I understood that survival meant more than running. It meant outthinking a predator older and wiser than any human mind could comprehend. By the fifth night, the whispers had become deafening. Every tree, every shadow seemed alive, pressing against my senses with intent. The orchard had transformed into a labyrinth of terror, its branches curling and twisting as if to trap me. Each step I took was mirrored by movement in the corners of my vision, silent figures gliding between the trees, studying my reactions. I gathered what courage I had and moved toward the clearing once more. The tall, faceless figure waited, flanked by smaller humanoid forms that crouched low, limbs bending unnaturally. The symbols etched into the ground pulsed faintly, resonating with a hum that had followed me since the first night. It became clear that these markings were not just ritualistic. They were extensions of the orchard's consciousness, channels through which it observed and manipulated me. A cold dread gripped me as I realized the orchard had been preparing for this moment. It had studied humans before, learning, testing, and feeding on fear. I was not trespassing by accident. I had been lured, drawn to the center of its malevolence. Panic surged, yet I forced myself to focus. Survival meant understanding its intelligence, predicting its movements, and keeping my wits in a place where the very land sought to unhinge my mind. The sixth night brought a chilling revelation. The whispers had shifted. They were no longer just voices, but commands, pressing on my mind with precision. Every tree branch seemed to reach toward me, every shadow bending unnaturally, guiding my steps like a predator stalking prey. The orchard was alive in a way I could no longer deny. I entered the clearing again, flashlight trembling, heart hammering. The tall figure advanced slowly, each movement deliberate, limbs bending impossibly. The smaller figures flanked it, moving silently among the trees. The symbols on the ground pulsed brighter, the hum resonating in my chest. I realized the orchard was testing me, observing my reactions, learning my fears. It didn't need to touch me to exert power. It manipulated the very air, the shadows, even my own mind. In a desperate act, I tried to step backward, breaking the rhythm the orchard seemed to impose. Shadows lunged at me, but I dodged, narrowly avoiding unseen hands. I understood then that survival would not come from strength or speed, but from outthinking an intelligence far older and far more cunning than anything human. Each night in this orchard was a trial, a test, and I was learning slowly, painfully, that to leave alive, I would have to play its game and hope I didn't lose. By the seventh night, the orchard had become an inescapable maze. Shadows moved independently of the moonlight, branches curling as if to block every path. The whispers had transformed into a chorus, each voice layered and intelligible, taunting me, repeating my fears and secrets. Every step felt watched, every breath monitored. Driven by a mix of terror and desperation, I approached the central clearing once more. The tall, faceless figure stood waiting, limbs bent at impossible angles. Its presence radiated malevolence and intelligence, and the smaller humanoid forms moved silently among the trees, flanking me from all sides. The symbols on the ground glowed brighter, pulsing in rhythm with the orchard's voice. I realized that this was a living predator, observing, calculating, and testing me, feeding on fear and attention. The orchard itself seemed to respond to my movements, the trees leaning, shadows stretching, guiding me into the center. I felt trapped, yet compelled to continue. Every instinct screamed to flee. But survival required understanding the entity's intelligence, predicting its behavior, and outsmarting a being older than the land itself. The orchard's consciousness was patient, ancient, and horrifyingly aware of my every thought. The eighth night, I realized that I could no longer separate myself from the orchard. The trees, the shadows, and the symbols were extensions of a single intelligence. The whispers pulsed inside my mind, commanding and hypnotic, urging me to kneel, to surrender, to join the orchard in its dark purpose. I stepped into the center, flashlight shaking, every nerve screaming. The tall figure advanced, its faceless head tilting as if examining me. The smaller humanoid figures glided silently through the twisted branches, forming a circle around me. The symbols etched in the soil glowed brighter with every heartbeat, resonating with a deep hum that vibrated through my chest. I understood then that this was no ordinary haunting. The orchard was alive, sentient, and malevolent. It tested its prey, learned from them, and fed on the attention it demanded. The longer I stayed, the stronger its influence became. Shadows lunged and twisted, brushing against me without contact, a reminder that fear alone strengthened the orchard. I realized survival depended not just on speed, but on mental acuity and willpower. The orchard's consciousness was patient, deliberate, and terrifyingly intelligent, and it had made me its focus for the night. By the ninth night, exhaustion and terror had fused into a single, oppressive weight. Every creak of branches, every rustle of leaves, felt deliberate, as if the orchard itself were orchestrating my fear. The whispers inside my head were now clear commands, urging me to stay, to kneel, to surrender. Every instinct screamed to run, yet I felt rooted, trapped in a game far older than I could comprehend. I stepped into the clearing, flashlight shaking. The tall, faceless figure advanced slowly, limbs bending impossibly, flanked by smaller humanoid forms that glided between the trees. The ritual symbols pulsed with a dim, eerie light, resonating with the hum that vibrated through my chest. I realized that these entities didn't need to touch me. They manipulated the very air, the shadows, and my own mind. Panic surged, but I forced myself to think. Survival wasn't about fleeing blindly. It was about outsmarting an intelligence older and wiser than any human mind could grasp. The orchard had been preparing for me, studying my reactions, and now it was testing me. Every shadow, every whisper, every pulse in the soil was a calculated challenge, and I had to navigate it carefully if I wanted to leave alive. The 10th night brought the terrifying climax. I knew that fleeing alone would not guarantee survival. The orchard had merged into a single, sentient predator. Every shadow, every whisper, every movement of the trees was calculated, patient, deliberate. The tall figure and its minions advanced, surrounding me in the center of the glowing ritual symbols. The hum reverberated through my body, syncing with my heartbeat, pressing on my mind with force. The whispers became commands. Stay, belong, join us. I understood that the orchard fed on attention, fear, and submission. Survival required more than instinct. It required outthinking a force far beyond human comprehension. In a desperate move, I darted through the twisted tree corridors, zigzagging to break the rhythm the orchard imposed. Shadows lunged at me, yet I narrowly avoided them, finally reaching the edge of the orchard. Gasping, I looked back. Shadows receded, the hum faded, and the glowing symbols dimmed. I had survived, but the orchard had left its mark on me. Every shadow, every rustle in the wind would forever carry the memory of its malevolent intelligence. The whispering orchard had claimed my attention, and the memory of its dark presence would haunt me for life. My name is Daniel Hayes, and this nightmare began the moment I accepted a seasonal job at an old farmhouse in the remote American countryside. Black Hollow, as the locals called it, was surrounded by dense forests and fog-laden fields. Its reputation was whispered quietly in town. Strange disappearances, inexplicable shadows, and eerie sounds that seemed to come from the trees themselves. I didn't believe the stories. Curiosity and the need for work outweighed fear. The first night, I explored the property. The farmhouse was dilapidated, yet oddly intact, with creaking floorboards and dust-covered furniture. Outside, the fog clung to the ground like a living thing, wrapping around trees and fence posts. That's when I first noticed movement, a fleeting shadow gliding between the trunks, too fast and fluid to be human. My pulse quickened, but I dismissed it as imagination. As I settled into the old guest room, I heard a low hum rising from the forest. It wasn't wind, not entirely. Something was watching, patient, intelligent, and aware of my presence. I could feel it in my chest, a vibration that resonated with fear itself. The shadows deepened at the window, and I realized that Black Hollow was alive in some way, observing my every movement. The first night ended with a glimpse of a figure in the mist, tall, faceless, and humanoid, standing motionless at the edge of the field. My curiosity had turned into a creeping dread that whispered, "You are not alone." The second night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the farmhouse, every whisper of the wind through the trees made my heart pound. The shadows outside seemed to move with purpose, not randomness. I could feel eyes on me, intelligent and patient, analyzing every step I took. The fog that blanketed the fields outside thickened, curling around the trees like ghostly fingers, pulling me toward the unknown. Around midnight, I heard a faint scraping at the door. My pulse spiked, and I froze. The sound was deliberate. too measured to be an animal. I gathered courage and opened the door. The fog had thickened into a wall, and I glimpsed movement. A tall, humanoid shadow gliding silently between the trees, limbs bending unnaturally. It stopped as if sensing my gaze, then vanished into the night. I returned inside, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. Shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch toward me, bending with a life of their own. The hum from the previous night returned, now layered with whispers, indistinct, yet chillingly familiar. Each word seemed to resonate in my chest, pressing against my thoughts. I realized then that Black Hollow wasn't merely haunted. It was aware, alive, and calculating. The property itself was an extension of some intelligence that thrived on fear. And tonight, it had marked me as its focus. By the third night, the farmhouse no longer felt like shelter. It felt like a cage. The fog refused to lift, even during the day, clinging to the land as if Black Hollow itself was holding its breath. I noticed new things then. Deep impressions in the soil around the house, long and narrow, like something had been standing there for hours, watching the windows. That evening, the hum returned stronger than before, vibrating through the walls and into my bones. I followed it outside despite every instinct screaming not to. The forest edge seemed closer than it had been before, the trees leaning inward, their branches forming crooked silhouettes against the sky. Shadows shifted between them, moving with coordination, not chaos. I saw multiple figures that night, tall, faceless, standing unnaturally still. When I took a step back, they took one forward. No sound, no breath, just silent intent. My fear wasn't what terrified me most. It was the sense that they were learning, observing how I reacted, measuring how much fear it took to make me run. When I finally fled back inside, the door slammed shut on its own. The shadows pressed against the windows, stretching, thinning, almost curious. Black Hollow wasn't attacking me yet. It was studying me. The fourth night was when Black Hollow made its intention clear. The whispers were no longer distant or vague. They spoke in fragments. My name, memories from my childhood, regrets I had never spoken aloud. Each word felt pulled directly from my mind, reshaped, and fed back to me. I barricaded myself in the living room, every light on, heart hammering. But light didn't matter. The shadows bled through it, stretching across walls and ceilings like dark veins. The hum intensified, rising and falling in a rhythm that matched my pulse. Outside, I heard footsteps circling the house, slow and deliberate, never stopping. A shadow peeled itself away from the wall near the fireplace, elongating into a humanoid shape. It didn't fully materialize, its edges blurred, unfinished, but its presence crushed the air from my lungs. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I understood then that these entities didn't need physical bodies. Black Hollow was their body. The figure leaned closer, and the whispers merged into a single thought inside my head. You are staying. That was the moment I realized escape wouldn't be simple. Black Hollow didn't just haunt people, it claimed them. By the fifth night, Black Hollow no longer waited for darkness to make itself known. The fog crept closer, even in daylight, swallowing the fields and blurring the tree line until the forest felt like it was breathing just beyond sight. I tried to leave that morning, packed my truck, keys in hand, but the engine refused to start. No sound, no struggle, just silence. That night, the whispers changed. They weren't probing anymore. They were confident, certain. Shadows gathered in corners, pooling like liquid darkness, stretching whenever I turned my back. I watched one slide across the floor, rising slowly until it resembled a standing figure, tall and impossibly thin. It didn't approach. It didn't need to. The hum intensified, vibrating through the floorboards, rattling picture frames. Outside, I saw them. Multiple figures standing at the edge of the field, perfectly spaced, facing the house. They didn't move, didn't sway, didn't blink. They were waiting. That's when I understood the truth. Black Hollow wasn't a place people wandered into by accident. It drew people in, studied them, tested their resistance. Fear wasn't the goal, it was the tool. And I had failed every test so far. The shadows pressed closer to the walls, and I felt something shift inside me. A quiet, horrifying realization settled in. Black Hollow didn't need to chase me anymore. I wasn't running. The sixth night broke something inside me. Sleep came in fragments, each one invaded by the same dream. Standing in the field, unable to move, while shadows circled closer with every breath. When I woke, the hum was already there, low and steady, vibrating through my skull. I stepped outside, compelled by something I couldn't explain. The fog parted just enough to reveal a narrow path leading toward the forest, one that hadn't existed before. The trees leaned inward, branches interlocking overhead, forming a tunnel of darkness. Shadows moved within it, guiding, inviting. As I followed the path, the air grew colder, heavier. The figures appeared again, closer now, their forms more defined yet still incomplete, as if reality itself struggled to finish shaping them. One stood directly in my path, its featureless face tilted, studying me, and the whispers flooded my mind with a single command. "Come home." Panic surged, and I staggered back, breaking whatever spell held me. The figures recoiled, not in anger, but curiosity. I ran, crashing through fog and branches, barely making it back to the farmhouse. I slammed the door behind me, gasping for air. The hum softened, almost amused. Black Hollow wasn't finished with me. It had simply learned something new. I could still resist, but not forever. By the seventh night, Black Hollow no longer hid its presence. The fog rolled in thick and fast, swallowing the farmhouse until the walls felt paper thin. The hum had evolved into something layered, multiple tones overlapping, like voices speaking just beneath hearing. Every shadow in the house moved with intent, stretching toward me no matter where I stood. I tried to stay awake, believing sleep would make me vulnerable. But exhaustion dragged me down. When my eyes opened again, I was standing in the field. I hadn't walked there. I hadn't chosen to be there. The farmhouse loomed behind me, distant and dark, while the forest ahead pulsed with shadow. Figures emerged from the fog, forming a wide circle around me. They were closer now, taller, more defined, yet still unfinished, as if reality resisted fully shaping them. Their faceless heads tilted in unison. The whispers merged into a single voice, calm and certain. "You belong to the Hollow." The ground beneath my feet vibrated, responding to the hum. I realized then that Black Hollow wasn't just a location. It was a consciousness. The land, the shadows, the figures were all parts of a single entity, ancient and patient. Panic surged as I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. Black Hollow wasn't testing me anymore. It was claiming me. The eighth night was the worst because it felt calm. The hum softened, almost soothing, and the shadows no longer lunged or stretched aggressively. Instead, they lingered near me, close enough to feel, distant enough to observe. The silence was intentional, like the pause before something irreversible. I noticed changes in myself. My thoughts felt slower, heavier. Memories blurred at the edges. When I looked at the forest, it felt familiar, comforting even. that terrified me more than the figures ever had. Black Hollow wasn't trying to break me, it was reshaping me. I stepped outside willingly this time, drawn toward the tree line. The fog parted as I walked, forming a clear path. Figures stood on either side, motionless like sentinels. As I reached the forest edge, the whispers returned, not as commands, but as reassurance. No fear here, no pain. For a moment, I considered stepping fully into the darkness, letting go, becoming part of whatever Black Hollow was. That's when I saw the farmhouse reflected in a window, my face pale, eyes hollow, barely recognizable. The sight snapped something inside me. I turned and ran. The hum spiked sharply, angry now. Shadows surged forward, and I barely made it back inside. The door slammed shut, shaking the walls. Black Hollow had almost won, and it knew it. By the 9th night, I understood the truth Black Hollow had been slowly revealing. It didn't need force. Time was its weapon. Every night stripped something away: sleep, logic, memory, until resistance felt pointless. The farmhouse felt smaller now, the walls closer, as if the land itself were tightening around me. The hum was constant, no longer rising or falling. It simply existed, vibrating through my chest, syncing with my heartbeat. Shadows no longer lurked at the edges of my vision. They stood openly in doorways, in corners, watching without secrecy. Their patience terrified me more than aggression ever could. I found old markings carved into the basement walls, names, dates, frantic messages begging forgiveness. None of them ended with escape. That's when I realized Black Hollow wasn't feeding on fear alone. It fed on permanence. People didn't disappear from this place. They stayed in forms the land could use. That night, the figures gathered closer than ever before. One stood inches from me, its presence crushing the air. The whispers spoke clearly now, no longer hiding their intent. This is where you end. I felt something inside me fracture. Not panic, but resolve. If Black Hollow wanted me broken, I would give it resistance instead. I didn't know how. I just knew I couldn't surrender. Not yet. The 10th night was the end, or the beginning. I didn't wait for the shadows to come to me. I walked into the field willingly, standing where the fog was thickest. The hum surged, violent and angry, as if the land itself protested my defiance. Figures emerged from every direction, surrounding me completely. I spoke out loud, my voice shaking, telling Black Hollow it didn't own me. The whispers screamed in response, flooding my mind with images of those who had failed before me. The ground trembled. Shadows lunged, but stopped inches away, as if restrained by something unseen. Then, suddenly, the hum cut out. Silence fell so hard it hurt. The figures recoiled, blurring at the edges, their forms destabilizing. I ran, not waiting to understand why. I didn't stop until dawn broke and the fog burned away under sunlight. By morning, Black Hollow looked ordinary, empty. The farmhouse stood quiet, the forest still. I left without looking back. But I know the truth. Black Hollow didn't release me, let me go. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the hum, still feel the shadows watching. Black Hollow remembers me. And one day, when I'm weak enough, it may call me home. My name is Aaron Mitchell, and this happened when I took a delivery job that sent me deep into the American countryside. Places where cell service dies, roads stop being marked, and locals avoid eye contact when you ask for directions. I was supposed to drop off equipment to a rural property outside a town so small it barely appeared on maps. The drive itself felt wrong. The highway narrowed into a cracked two-lane road, then into something even worse, an unpaved stretch cutting through endless farmland. Cornfields rose high on both sides, blocking the horizon. The GPS recalculated constantly, spinning like it was confused before finally going silent. That's when I noticed the road ahead didn't match anything behind me. The asphalt was unnaturally smooth, darker than it should have been, stretching straight into the distance without a single turn. No signs, no houses, no power lines, just road. I told myself to turn around, but when I checked the mirror, the road behind me was gone. In its place stood a wall of tall crops swaying gently, as if the road had never existed. My chest tightened as the engine began to vibrate, not struggling, but humming, deep and rhythmic. Then I saw it. Far ahead, something stood in the middle of the road. Too tall, too still, waiting. That was the moment I realized this road hadn't appeared by accident. It had been waiting for someone like me to drive onto it. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring at the thing in the distance. It hadn't moved, not even an inch. The longer I looked at it, the more wrong it felt. Not just tall, but proportionally incorrect, like its shape didn't belong in the real world. My instinct screamed at me to reverse. I slammed the truck into reverse and hit the gas. The engine roared, but the truck barely moved. When I looked in the mirrors again, the cornfields were closer now, pressed tight against the road, their stalks brushing the sides of the vehicle. There was no sign of the road I had come from. No tire tracks, no gap. Panic surged through me. I shifted into drive and sped forward, eyes locked on the figure ahead. As I got closer, the hum returned. Low, mechanical, vibrating through the steering wheel and into my chest. The radio crackled to life on its own, spitting out fragments of static that almost sounded like words. The figure shifted, not walking, sliding, gliding a few feet closer without bending its limbs. My breath caught in my throat. I swerved instinctively, but the road remained perfectly straight, refusing to curve or widen. That's when I noticed something worse. The sky above the road was changing. Stars vanished. Clouds froze in place. Everything beyond the road felt staged, artificial, like a backdrop. This wasn't just a road. It was a boundary, and I had crossed into something that didn't want me to leave. The longer I drove, the more impossible the road became. My speedometer climbed past 60, then 70, but nothing around me changed. The cornfields stayed perfectly aligned, their tops swaying in slow, synchronized waves. The figure ahead remained the same distance away, no matter how fast I went. Then the road signs appeared, old, rusted metal signs with no reflective paint, no symbols, just words scratched deep into the surface. The first one read, "Turn back." A mile later, another appeared. "You missed it." My mouth went dry. There was nothing to miss. No exits, no intersections, just the road. The radio crackled again, this time clearer. Between bursts of static, I heard a man's voice, panicked, breathless, begging for help. He described the same road, the same fields, the same figure. Then his voice cut off mid-sentence, replaced by the low hum vibrating through my bones. I glanced at the rearview mirror and nearly screamed. The figure was closer now, much closer. Its limbs were elongated, joints bent at wrong angles, its head tilted slightly, as if curious. It didn't chase. It didn't rush. It simply advanced, confident that the road belonged to it. That was when I understood something horrifying. The road wasn't taking me somewhere. It was keeping me here. The fourth stretch of the road felt longer than time itself. My phone was dead. The truck's dashboard clock spun wildly before going blank. Even my thoughts felt delayed, as if the road was slowing more than just movement. It was slowing me. Then the road changed. Houses appeared on either side, old farmhouses half sunk into the soil, windows dark, porches collapsing inward. They looked abandoned, yet I felt eyes watching from every doorway. The cornfields pulled back just enough to make room for them, like the road was offering shelter. I stopped. I don't know why. Maybe hope, maybe exhaustion. As I stepped out, the air felt thick, heavy, resisting every movement. From inside one of the houses, I heard a knock. Slow, rhythmic, intentional. A door creaked open by itself. Inside, the walls were covered with carved lines, tallies, hundreds of them. Names followed some of the marks. Others were scratched so deeply they tore through the wood. I found one freshly carved at the bottom. Aaron M. The hum surged violently, and I ran back to the truck. As I slammed the door, the houses vanished behind me, replaced once again by endless cornfields. The road hadn't shown me shelter. It had shown me my place in its history. After the farmhouses disappeared, the road finally began to curve. That terrified me more than its endless straightness. Roads don't curve without reason. Curves lead somewhere or trap you deeper. The figure ahead was gone, but I could feel it now, closer than sight allowed. The hum returned, stronger, pulsing through the steering wheel, vibrating in my teeth. With every mile, the corn leaned closer to the asphalt, stalks bending inward as if listening. I noticed footprints on the road, bare feet, too large, too long. They weren't walking away from me. They were walking beside my truck, matching my speed. Then something slammed against the side panel. Not hard, deliberate, a test. Another hit followed, closer to my window. I refused to look, gripping the wheel until my hands cramped. The radio burst to life again, but this time the voice was mine. It repeated things I hadn't said out loud. Thoughts, fears, memories I'd buried. Each word came a second before I thought it, like the road was rehearsing me. The curve ended abruptly. The road narrowed into a single lane, and painted across the asphalt in fading white letters were words I will never forget. Only one way out. The road ended at a wooden bridge suspended over nothing. No river, no ravine, just blackness beneath the planks, swallowing all light. The hum fell silent, replaced by complete, suffocating quiet. At the center of the bridge stood the figure. Now I could see it clearly. Its skin looked stretched, unfinished, like it had been pulled from multiple people and stitched into one shape. Its face wasn't empty, it was crowded. Faces layered into it, pressed beneath the surface, mouths frozen mid-scream. It raised an arm and pointed, not at the bridge, but at me. The radio clicked on one last time. A calm voice spoke, not unkindly. Leave the road, or become it. Behind me, the cornfields were gone. The road stretched backward only a few feet before dissolving into darkness. There was no turning around. I closed my eyes and floored the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, wood cracking beneath the tires as the bridge groaned in protest. The figure didn't move. It simply watched, as if amused. Then the bridge vanished. I woke up in a ditch miles from any marked road, my truck wrecked, engine cold. The GPS showed nothing, no route, no record. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the hum, and I know the road remembers me. The doctors told me I'd been lucky. A rural highway patrol found my truck at dawn, wedged in a ditch with no skid marks leading to it. They said I must have fallen asleep at the wheel. I didn't argue. There was no language for what really happened. But the road didn't let me forget. In the weeks after the crash, I began noticing changes. Roads I drove daily felt wrong, longer than before, straighter. I'd take a familiar turn and end up somewhere unfamiliar, passing the same barn twice, then a third time. GPS routes recalculated endlessly, spinning like a confused compass. At night, I dreamed of the bridge, of standing in the middle of it, staring down into the black void, feeling something beneath the planks breathe. Sometimes I woke with splinters embedded in my palms, wood dust on my sheets. The hum returned quietly, not loud enough to hear, loud enough to feel. It came when I drove alone, when the road stretched empty ahead of me, when the cornfields pressed close. One evening, I found fresh footprints outside my apartment. Bare, too long. They stopped at my door. That was when I realized the truth. I hadn't escaped the road. I'd been released, and roads don't release anything without purpose. 3 months later, the hum became a voice. Not words, directions, urges, subtle suggestions about shortcuts I should take, back roads that didn't appear on any map. It always sounded helpful, friendly. I resisted until the night my sister called, crying, stranded somewhere outside town. Her GPS had died. She didn't recognize the road she was on. My blood ran cold as she described the cornfields, the silence, the way the road refused to end. I didn't tell her to turn back. I told her to stay where she was. When I arrived, the road was waiting. Perfect, clean, familiar. The hum welcomed me like an old friend. My headlights caught a figure standing far ahead, exactly where it had before. I understood then what the road wanted. It didn't want victims. It wanted guides. People who had survived it. People who could lead others in without force. I parked the truck and stepped out, standing in the middle of the asphalt. The figure behind me placed a hand on my shoulder. Heavy, cold, proud. The road stretched forward, endless and patient. And somewhere behind me, another car turned onto it. I don't remember deciding to stay on the road. That's the part that scares me most. One moment I was standing there, feeling the weight of that hand on my shoulder, and the next I was waving the approaching car forward, smiling, reassuring. The driver rolled down his window. He looked tired, lost, exactly the way I must have looked that first night. I told him there was an accident ahead, that the main highway was closed, and this road would take him safely around it. The words came naturally, practiced, as if I'd said them before. He hesitated. The hum deepened, urging me on. I leaned closer and lowered my voice, telling him I'd driven this way dozens of times, that it was quiet, faster, safer. He thanked me. Then he turned onto the road. The moment his headlights passed me, the road changed. The cornfields leaned inward again. The sky darkened. The painted words reappeared on the asphalt, though they now read something different. Welcome back. The figure stepped forward beside me, no longer needing to hide its shape. I felt something settle into place inside my chest, like a lock turning. Another set of headlights appeared in the distance, and without thinking, I raised my hand to wave them in. They still think I survived a crash. My family says I changed after it. Quieter, distant, always watching the road when we drive together. They don't notice how my eyes linger on unmarked turns, how my body tenses when we pass cornfields at night. Sometimes, when traffic is heavy, I feel restless. The hum grows impatient. It wants silence. It wants isolation. It wants drivers who won't be missed until morning. I take long drives now, alone. I park near rural highways and wait. When someone pulls over, confused, I step out to help. I give directions. I smile. I make myself trustworthy. I never lie. The road does lead somewhere. Late at night, I stand at the edge of the asphalt and feel it breathing beneath my feet. I feel the bridge waiting. I feel the names pressing up through the surface, trying to be remembered. Mine hasn't appeared yet. Not carved, not painted. That's how I know my job isn't finished. If you ever find yourself on a road that doesn't end, and a stranger waves you forward with confidence, don't follow him. Because sometimes the road doesn't hunt. Sometimes it recruits. My name is Lila Thompson, and this happened when I inherited my uncle's farm in rural Pennsylvania. The property had been abandoned for years, the fields overgrown, the barn falling in on itself. Everyone in town told me to sell it quickly. They said it wasn't worth the trouble. I thought they were exaggerating. The first night I stayed there, the wind carried more than just the chill of autumn. There were whispers, low, almost melodic, drifting from the direction of the barn. I convinced myself it was the wind passing through broken wood and cracked windows. But the words were unmistakable. My name. Curiosity, or foolishness, drove me to investigate. The barn's doors hung crooked, barely clinging to their hinges. Inside, darkness pooled in the corners. The smell was the worst part. Damp earth mixed with something metallic, sharp, and alive. Shadows moved where none should have been, stretching along the hay bales and broken machinery. I set up a small lantern in the center, shaking, and tried to listen to the whispers. They weren't random. They spoke in fragments, like someone, or something, was trying to tell me a story. Help. Don't. Leave. I wanted to leave immediately, but my instincts pushed me closer. The barn felt alive, breathing in rhythm with my heartbeat. Every step I took made the whispers louder, more urgent. That's when I realized this barn didn't just contain darkness. It was darkness, and it knew I was there. I spent the second night in the farmhouse, but sleep never came. Every creak of the old wooden floor, every rustle outside, felt amplified. The whispers returned, soft, persistent, circling my mind. They weren't coming from the barn anymore. They were inside me. By midnight, I couldn't resist. I grabbed a flashlight and walked back to the barn. The air grew colder with each step. When I opened the doors, I realized something horrifying. The barn seemed larger inside than outside. Shadows pooled in impossible corners, bending space. The hay smelled sharper now, metallic. The whispers grew distinct. Lila, help us. Trapped. I followed the sound, crawling through stacks of hay bales. Faces, pale, hollow, and desperate, emerged briefly from the darkness, vanishing when I blinked. I didn't recognize them, but their eyes screamed familiarity. In the far corner, I found an old trapdoor hidden beneath rotting planks. The whispers screamed at me now, pulling me toward it. Trembling, I lifted it and peered into the void. A staircase led down into total darkness. Cold air rushed up like it had been waiting for centuries. I hesitated. Something inside warned me to leave, but another part, something I couldn't control, pulled me down. I took my first step into the blackness, feeling the barn's heartbeat sync with mine. Whatever was down there had been waiting for me. The staircase led down into a pit of darkness so complete that my flashlight barely illuminated the first few steps. The whispers intensified, overlapping now, hundreds of voices layered together. Trapped. Lila, help. Trapped. The words weren't just heard. They pressed against my chest, tugging at my mind, demanding attention. At the bottom, I stepped onto dirt that felt alive under my feet, shifting slightly as if breathing. The walls were covered in old, carved symbols, unfamiliar but precise, forming patterns that seemed to pulse when I stared. Shadows moved independently of the lantern's light, stretching across the floor, twisting into humanoid shapes. Something scraped against the wall behind me. I spun around, but nothing was there. Then I felt it. Hands, cold, weightless, brushing my shoulders and arms. I froze. The whispers surged into a single voice, clear and desperate. "Join us. Stay. Forever." I backed up and tripped over a loose plank, landing hard. That's when I saw them, figures cowering in the darkness. Hollow-eyed, thin, their bodies wrapped in tattered remnants of clothing clinging to each other. They weren't moving toward me, but begging me silently with trembling hands, as if the barn itself commanded their obedience. A sharp, metallic smell filled the air. My stomach churned. The barn wasn't just haunted, it was alive, feeding on fear, capturing souls, and now it was deciding whether I belonged. I scrambled backward, trying to reach the trapdoor. The whispers twisted into laughter now, cruel and mocking, echoing from every corner. The floor beneath me shifted. The barn itself seemed to tilt, walls breathing in and out, compressing the space around me. One of the hollow figures reached out, its fingers long, thin, and bone-white, brushing my hand. Shock ran through me. Its eyes weren't empty. They were pleading, warning me of the barn's hunger. I realized then, it didn't want to harm me. Not yet. It wanted to claim me. I forced myself to stand, breathing ragged. The symbols on the walls pulsed brighter as I moved. Each step toward the trapdoor was met with resistance, as if the barn's dark energy pressed against me. The whispers had become a physical weight, dragging at my limbs, my consciousness. Finally, I reached the trapdoor. My hands shook as I pried it open, the hinges screeching in protest. Light from above spilled into the darkness like salvation. I scrambled up, pulling myself through just as the cellar seemed to exhale, a sound like hundreds of sighs escaping at once. I slammed the trapdoor behind me. The whispers faded to murmurs, but they didn't stop. The barn was patient. It had tested me, and it had already started plotting the next time I returned. The days following my descent into the barn were unbearable. I tried to work the fields, fix fences, even clean the farmhouse, but the whispers followed me. They weren't constant, but when they appeared, they were unmistakable. Low, urgent, and persistent. "Lila, come back. Stay." At night, they were louder. The barn seemed to breathe across the property, even from a distance. I began noticing subtle changes in the environment. Shadows elongated unnaturally. Trees bent slightly toward the barn. Corn stalks rustled even when the wind was absent. I started seeing the figures again. Pale, hollow-eyed, always at the edge of vision. Sometimes in the reflection of the farmhouse windows, sometimes between the trees. They never approached directly. They simply watched, waiting for me to make a mistake. One evening, I heard the metallic scent again, stronger than before. It led me back to the barn, though I swore I hadn't moved in that direction. The doors were closed, yet I felt the air shift, like it was exhaling in anticipation. Inside, the trapdoor had moved. Not far, just a few feet, but enough to remind me the barn wasn't fixed. It wasn't just a structure, it was alive, and it was adapting. I had a choice: leave and never return, or descend again and confront whatever was waiting. My curiosity outweighed my fear. I climbed down once more, feeling the barn's heartbeat sync with my own. This time, the cellar was different. The carved symbols glowed brighter, pulsating in rhythm with the whispers. Figures no longer crouched. They stood silently, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I realized they weren't afraid. I was. The barn's influence had spread. Walls shifted subtly, and the floor beneath me hummed as if testing my balance. The whispers spoke in unison now. Join. Become one. Stay. One figure stepped forward, raising a hand toward me. I noticed the shadows beneath it moved independently, crawling along the walls, writhing like liquid darkness. I wanted to scream, but couldn't. My voice was caught in my throat. Then the metallic smell became unbearable. I gagged, leaning against the wall. The barn pulsed, each beat echoing through the cellar, through me, as if it were drawing energy. The figures murmured, a choir of longing and desperation, pleading for release, for someone to share their eternal prison. I realized something horrifying. The barn didn't just trap souls. It reshaped them. Those figures were once human, and now they existed only to serve the barn's will. And it had plans for me. I climbed back up, heart pounding, and slammed the trapdoor behind me. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed me into the farmhouse, into the fields, into every quiet moment. The barn had marked me. Weeks passed, and the barn's presence infiltrated every corner of my life. Even when I stayed inside the farmhouse, I could feel it in the walls, in the creaking floors, in the air itself. The whispers no longer required the barn to be near. They floated in my mind, subtle at first, then persistent. Lila, we're waiting. I started avoiding the fields during the day. Even sunlight couldn't block the sensation of being watched. Corn stalks seemed to twitch as I passed. Shadows moved with intention, mirroring me in ways that were impossible. Sleep offered no refuge. In my dreams, the barn expanded infinitely, ceilings rising to impossible heights. The figures walked among me, silent, hollow-eyed. They spoke without moving their lips, filling my mind with memories that weren't mine, pain I hadn't felt, voices I didn't recognize. One evening, I found a note on the farmhouse table. No handwriting I knew, just one word: return. Panic surged, but curiosity and terror pulled me toward the barn once more. This time, I didn't hesitate. I opened the doors and stepped inside, feeling the air thicken as if welcoming me home. The trapdoor was open again. The shadows waited. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening chorus. I knew then. The barn had chosen me. Inside the cellar, the air was suffocating, thick with the metallic smell I had come to dread. The symbols on the walls pulsed with a rhythm matching the whispers, now impossible to ignore. They reverberated in my chest, syncing with my heartbeat. The figure stepped closer this time. I could see the details now, their skin pallid, stretched, with hollow eyes that reflected centuries of despair. They didn't attack. They simply observed, studying me, testing me. The barn's will was concentrated in them, and I felt it pressing against my mind. I tried to move, but the floor beneath me seemed to shift like living soil, rooting me in place. The whispers became a single voice in my head, intimate, coaxing. Join. Belong. Forever. A hand touched my shoulder. Not a shadow, not a figure, but something real. Ice cold, heavy. I felt my will weaken under the weight of centuries of trapped souls, all waiting for a successor, a guide, another to lead the next unsuspecting wanderer. I pulled myself toward the staircase, gasping, resisting the pull of the barn. The trap door above shimmered like a promise. As I climbed, I knew leaving didn't mean freedom. The barn had claimed a piece of me already. Once outside, I felt its gaze linger, waiting, watching, patient. I would return, eventually. Days blurred into nights. I tried to act normal, tending to the farm, answering calls from neighbors, even laughing at dinner. But the whispers never stopped. They were in my mind now, subtle, persuasive, like a shadow stretching through my thoughts. Return. We need you. The barn waits. I tried ignoring it, tried locking myself inside the farmhouse. But every time I closed my eyes, the barn appeared in my mind, its walls breathing, the trapdoor glowing faintly. The figures crouched at the edges of my vision, waiting for my surrender. One morning, I noticed a small pile of hay in the living room. Not mine. Arranged into a rough, humanoid shape. The whispers were louder that day, now overlapping with scratching sounds on the floorboards. I understood then that the barn could reach me anywhere. By evening, I gave in. I approached the barn willingly, lantern in hand, heart pounding with a mix of fear and inevitability. The air thickened as I crossed the threshold, and the trapdoor glimmered, inviting me into its depths. The figures waited, silent, patient, knowing I would obey. The barn didn't need to chase me anymore. I was already part of its hunger, already bound to its rhythm. I descended into the cellar one last time, fully aware of what awaited. The symbols on the walls glowed intensely, pulsing with life. The figures stood silently, their hollow eyes fixated, waiting for me to join them. The whispers were no longer voices. They were commands, dictating my thoughts, shaping my movements. My body obeyed before I could question. I moved to the center of the cellar, the metallic smell thick in my lungs, feeling the weight of countless souls pressing against my skin. A hand, ice cold, firm, touched my shoulder. I shivered, knowing this was the barn's final claim. The trapdoor above me shimmered faintly, a memory of freedom that would never be mine. I knelt as the shadows closed in. The whispers merged into a single, omniscient voice. Welcome, Guardian, forever. From that moment, I was no longer Lila Thompson. I was part of the barn, its hunger, its sentience. Outside, the farmhouse appeared normal. The fields seemed quiet. Neighbors saw a woman tending her land. But I knew the truth. The barn waits. And now, I wait with it. Anyone who dares approach will meet me first, and I will guide them inside. My name is Caleb Moore, and this happened when I moved to a small, isolated town in rural Kentucky. I was a freelance photographer, drawn to abandoned places and the forgotten corners of the countryside. The locals spoke little about the old cemetery at the edge of town, tucked behind dense woods. They warned me to stay away, but curiosity outweighed caution. The first time I saw it, the cemetery was overgrown, iron fences rusted, headstones cracked and leaning as if bowing under their own weight. A heavy fog clung to the ground, thick enough to make even my boots wet through. As I stepped closer, I noticed something odd. None of the graves had names, not a single one, only dates. Some were centuries old, others recent, though the ground had barely settled. I felt a chill sweep through me. The air was thick, almost alive. And then I heard it. Whispers again. Soft, sorrowful, coming from between the gravestones. Caleb, leave, join us. I spun around. No one was there. The fog seemed to shift, forming vague shapes that vanished when I blinked. Yet the whispers persisted, carrying a weight that pressed into my mind. I took a step forward, camera in hand. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but something deeper, curiosity, obsession, maybe foolishness, pushed me onward. By the time I reached the oldest gravestone, the whispering had become a low chant, resonating in my chest, promising secrets buried long ago. I spent the next few nights unable to sleep. The whispers haunted my dreams, soft and sorrowful, repeating over and over. Caleb, come back. The forgotten waits. Every time I closed my eyes, the fogged cemetery appeared, stretching endlessly, headstones leaning closer, shadows writhing between them. The next evening, I returned with my camera, determined to capture evidence. The moment I stepped onto the damp earth, the air changed. It was heavier, denser, pressing against my chest as if trying to push me back. The fog moved unnaturally, curling around the gravestones in patterns too precise to be wind. I noticed something new. Small footprints leading between the graves, appearing and disappearing under my gaze. They were too small for an adult, too deep for the soil to form naturally. And then I heard movement, a soft rustling behind me. I spun, flashlight cutting through the fog. Nothing. But the whispers had changed. Clearer. Closer. "Caleb, join us. Remember?" They seemed to echo my own thoughts, intruding into my mind with an intimacy that made my skin crawl. I felt the pull. Something in the cemetery wanted me to leave my world behind, to become part of its secrets. My curiosity warred with fear, and yet I could not leave. With a shaky hand, I stepped deeper into the gravestones, feeling the fog wrap around me like a living entity, guiding me forward. As I ventured deeper into the cemetery, the fog thickened, nearly obscuring the gravestones. Shapes moved within it, pale, indistinct forms that darted away when I tried to focus on them. The whispers were louder now, overlapping, a chorus of pleading voices. "Caleb, remember? Stay with us." I stumbled upon a section of graves that were unlike the others. These headstones were freshly turned, the dirt loose and dark, though the dates engraved went back decades. I knelt to examine them, and my stomach turned. The names carved into the stone weren't real, at least not to the living world. They were faces I recognized from old photographs of the town, long-forgotten residents whose disappearances were never solved. The whispers became distinct, urgent, pushing me toward one particular gravestone. A hand, icy and ethereal, brushed against my arm. I froze, paralyzed by a mixture of fear and awe. The figures in the fog moved closer, their hollow eyes pleading, watching. A sudden chill ran through my spine. I realized the cemetery didn't want visitors. It wanted memories. It wanted acknowledgement. And now, it wanted me to remember everything it had swallowed over the centuries. Every instinct screamed at me to run. But the fog seemed to wrap around my legs like thick vines, pulling me forward. I couldn't stop. The gravestone that called to me bore no name, only a date. 1872. The whispering intensified, now a single, commanding voice. "Caleb, remember." My hands trembled as I touched the stone. A cold energy shot up my arms, filling my mind with fragmented images. Old townspeople, funerals long forgotten, children playing in fields now overgrown with weeds, all disappearing into shadows. I realized the cemetery was not just haunted, it was sentient. It preserved memories, souls, and stories long lost to time, and it demanded acknowledgement. Every gravestone, every figure in the fog, was a fragment of the forgotten, trapped in this endless limbo. I stumbled back, trying to process it all. My camera had fallen to the ground, but when I picked it up, the viewfinder revealed more than I could see with my eyes. Faces pressed against the lens, hollow and desperate, mouthing silent pleas. I dropped the camera in shock, the whispers now loud enough to echo in my skull. A cold wind swept through the cemetery, bending the fog and distorting the gravestones. The figures began to reach out, circling me like a tide, waiting for me to succumb to their pull. I knew then. Leaving the cemetery without acknowledging it would mean losing more than my curiosity. It would mean becoming part of its forgotten forever. I tried to leave, But the cemetery had other plans. The fog thickened with every step I took, coiling around my legs like cold, living tendrils. The whispers were relentless now, not just urging, but demanding. Stay. Remember. Become part of us. I stumbled into a small clearing, where a half-collapsed mausoleum waited, almost hidden beneath the twisted roots of an ancient tree. The air inside smelled of damp earth and decay. Shadows flickered along the walls, moving independently of the flickering lantern light. My heart pounded in my chest, but something, an unshakable curiosity, drove me forward. Inside, the mausoleum walls were lined with niches containing tiny, skeletal figures curled in fetal positions. The whispers became almost intelligible, telling me stories of lives long forgotten, secrets of families lost to the earth. I realized then that the cemetery didn't just want acknowledgement. It wanted remembrance, someone to feel their stories, someone to witness the forgotten. The figures in the niches seemed to shift when I looked away. I felt icy fingers brush against my arms, my neck, my face. The fog outside pressed against the walls, spilling in like a tide, carrying the cries and whispers of hundreds, maybe thousands, of lost souls. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to obey. I was already ensnared. The cemetery had claimed my attention, and it would not let go. The mausoleum seemed alive. Walls creaked as if inhaling, and the niches pulsed faintly, like hearts beating beneath stone. The whispers grew louder, layering themselves atop one another until I couldn't tell my thoughts from theirs. Caleb. Stay, remember. I felt something brush my face, a cold, skeletal hand, and I stumbled back, nearly falling into one of the niches. The figures shifted closer, their hollow eyes pleading. I realized that the cemetery didn't just want me to see its dead, it wanted me to join them, to remember until I became part of their eternal limbo. Desperation clawed at me. I tried to shout, to run, but my voice caught in my throat. The fog seeped inside like smoke, curling around my ankles, my waist, pulling at me. My mind reeled from the flood of stories, the centuries of lives compressed into whispers. I understood the truth. This place didn't forget. Every soul trapped here had once ignored its call, and the cemetery was patient. It waited for someone to feel, to witness, to acknowledge. And then it claimed them, piece by piece, memory by memory. Trembling, I staggered out, gasping for air, feeling the weight of countless eyes on me. Outside, the fog lingered, thick and alive. The cemetery had not released me. Not yet. Even outside the mausoleum, the cemetery's influence clung to me like a second skin. The fog trailed me as I walked back toward town, curling around my feet, whispering my name. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustling tree a silent witness to my trespass. I tried to convince myself it was imagination, but then I saw them. Figures at the edge of the fog, pale, hollow-eyed, moving closer with each step. They didn't speak, but the air around them vibrated with memory, sorrow, and longing. They weren't trying to harm me. They were trying to draw me in, piece by piece. That night, the whispers followed me into my bedroom. I awoke gasping, my sheets tangled around my arms as the chorus of voices grew louder. Names, dates, events I didn't know, yet somehow recognized, replayed in my mind. I understood then that the cemetery's grasp wasn't limited to the land it occupied. It invaded memory, thought, and soul. By the next evening, I found myself walking back to the fog-covered gravestones, compelled. My camera in hand felt heavy, as if aware of the cemetery's will. The voices urged me forward. Remember, Caleb, remember. I knew I was crossing a line. One more step, one more photograph, one more acknowledgement. And I would be bound to the forgotten, never to return fully to the living world. The fog thickened as I entered the heart of the cemetery. Gravestones leaned unnaturally, roots twisting across cracked earth like veins. The whispers were deafening now, overlapping hundreds of lives compressed into a single, pleading command. Join. Remember. Never forget. I raised my camera to capture the scene, but through the lens, I saw more than the fog and gravestones. Faces pressed against the glass, skeletal hands clawing silently. Hollow eyes stared into mine, not threatening, but imploring. I realized then that the camera had become a conduit, a bridge between the living and the forgotten. I backed away, but the fog had closed in, swirling around me like living smoke. Names, dates, stories I could not possibly know pressed into my mind. Memories of lives snatched too early, secrets buried beneath centuries of earth. My hands shook as I struggled to release the camera. The cemetery didn't want me to take photographs. It wanted me to see everything, remember everything, and, in remembering, become part of its endless collection of the forgotten. I stumbled, the earth beneath me softening, pulling almost as if the ground itself wanted to claim me. The whispers crescendoed into a chorus of despair, echoing through the fog, promising eternal remembrance and eternal captivity. I could no longer distinguish reality from the cemetery's influence. Each step forward was guided by the whispers, compelling me to move deeper into the fog. The gravestones leaned closer, their inscriptions unreadable yet heavy with meaning, pressing memories into my mind that weren't mine. The figures appeared in full form now, pale, hollow-eyed, drifting silently between gravestones. They didn't speak aloud, yet their presence screamed in my mind. Remember, join us. Caleb. I realized the cemetery fed on memory. Each soul it trapped became part of the fog, the whispers, the leaning gravestones. And now it wanted me. My body wanted to run, but my mind, the part that had absorbed centuries of whispers, was already slipping. At one point, I fell to my knees, chest heaving. Fog coiled around me like tendrils, pulling, urging, wrapping me in its cold embrace. Names, faces, events I never knew swirled through my thoughts. I understood with horrifying clarity. If I left now, the cemetery would follow. It would never release me. Not completely. And so, I took a final step forward, into the deepest part of the cemetery, where the oldest grave stood, silent and patient. The oldest gravestone rose before me, cracked and moss-covered, glowing faintly as the whispers converged into one commanding voice. Remember. Forever. I touched the stone, and a surge of centuries of memory rushed through me. Lost townspeople, forgotten families, lives erased from history. I stumbled back, but the cemetery had already claimed me. I could feel its weight in my chest, its presence in my mind. The figures closed in, not as threats, but as welcoming guides. The fog thickened, swirling around me like a living shroud, merging my identity with the forgotten. I raised my camera once more, now trembling. Through the lens, I could see the past, present, and future of the cemetery entwined. Every soul that had disappeared over the decades now stared at me, their stories flooding into my consciousness. I understood. Leaving alive would never be an option. My body may walk out someday, but a piece of me would remain forever, bound to the cemetery, a keeper of the forgotten. I finally fell to my knees, surrendering, letting the fog envelop me completely. The whispers softened, a gentle chorus of acceptance. I had become part of the cemetery. Outside, the fog thinned. The town remained unchanged. But the cemetery waits. It always waits. As the night deepens and the shadows stretch across the countryside, we come to the end of our journey through the unknown. 8 horrifying tales, each one a window into places where darkness lingers, where forgotten corners of the world conceal secrets too terrifying to speak aloud. From the eerie whispers of the haunted barn to the relentless grasp of the forgotten cemetery, these stories show that the countryside is far from peaceful. Its quiet often hides unspeakable horrors. These were not legends or campfire tales. These were real, documented encounters. Moments experienced by ordinary people who stumbled upon the inexplicable, the supernatural, and the deadly. From abandoned farmhouses to haunted forests. From restless spirits to entities beyond human comprehension. The events you've witnessed tonight prove that terror can wait silently behind the familiar, ready to strike when least expected. And while the stories end here, the darkness does not. Every shadow you pass, every lonely road, every overgrown field could conceal echoes of these very horrors. Remember the whispers, the unseen eyes, the creatures that should not exist, and the souls trapped in places forgotten by time. If you felt a chill, if you've imagined the eyes watching, you are not alone. Keep your curiosity sharp, but never forget, some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. Thanks for watching. This was Dark Fears.